Thanks so much, Amit. So, thanks so much for agreeing to talk. And
Pleasure.
talk about what's an incredibly important issue in a pretty bruising state campaign that seems like it's the preamble for a potentially more bruising federal election campaign. I kind of wanted to start it super broad. The 2016 census data shows that more people than ever don't speak English as their first language at home. So, and about a third of the population wasn't born in Australia. So in many ways, we're a more multicultural nation than we've ever been before. At the same time, we have people like Pauline Hanson, who I know you have an interesting story about. George Christensen, Bob Katter, and the list goes on. Only last week, a Victorian Liberal candidate quit because she previously made calls for all Muslim migration to be halted. So we're seeing people more and more leveraging these fears. Do you think we're on a trajectory now, similar to the US, where fear will drive votes and change policy?
I think there's a real risk we are on that sort of trajectory. I think that's absolutely right. And I suppose the one thing to say about what's going on here in Australia is that we're not immune from these global currents. Very clearly, this is something that's going on right around the world with the emergence of Donald Trump, obviously, in the US, Brexit in the UK, the emergence of far-right parties in Europe. So this is something that is going on right around the world, and Australia's not immune from that. We've got obviously Pauline Hanson here. You mentioned some of the other people within the coalition. And what I think, in my view, it's really important to sort of take a step back and try and understand what's driving it. And I think that we've got to be careful we don't fall into this trap that suddenly, people around the world have become more racist than they were a few decades ago. I mean, there's something that's sitting underneath it. Racism's, I think, always been part of the human condition. My view of it would be that, this is part of, if you subscribe to that field of evolutionary biology where we grew up in groups, there was always, fear of the other. That's part of the human condition. But I think what's happened over recent decades is you're seeing increasing economic inequality across a number of different societies. So, in the US, wage growth is stagnant, much like here in Australia. You're seeing a very small group within our society continue to benefit from the economic growth that Australia's enjoyed for many years. And so I think sitting underneath what's driving this at the moment is this increasing economic inequality that's fueling politicians who are able to manufacture this sort of cynical fiction that the problems that people are experiencing are caused by, immigrants, foreigners, people who have recently made Australia their home. So I think unless we really go to those sort of root causes, then we're always going to be vulnerable to a sort of very cynical, divisive politics. Societies change. People used to be able to go and get a job and be in the same job for a generation. There was a lot more certainty around people's employment. As I said, wage growth was sort of part of this compact that we all agreed in the 80s. As a result of economic growth, we'd see wage growth. And it's just not happening now. Over recent decades, wages are stagnant. You're seeing this increasing concentration of wealth within a narrower segment of the community, and politicians exploit it. So the question I suppose you're asking is, could this become a bigger problem here in Australia? And the short answer is yes, it could be. And I think we've got a taste of it today with the announcement from the Prime Minister. I suspect we'll get a chance to talk about that today. But I worry that that is part of what we're going to see increasingly over the next few months and in the lead up to the federal election campaign, is politicians who are manufacturing this cynical fiction that it's not their fault, it's actually the fault of people who have chosen to make Australia their home. Now, our challenge is to really, firstly, reaffirm all of the great things about multiculturalism. Multiculturalism's part of Australia's, it's the reason Australia's been such a successful and prosperous nation. It's the story of multiculturalism is the story of Australia and the story of Australia's success. And it's the story of many millions of Australians as well. It's still a notion that is embraced by most Australians. You look at the Scanlon Foundation and the data shows most people support multiculturalism. They want to see Australia continue to head down this path. So I suppose I've got that sense of optimism, but tempered with, real caution that we are heading on this track.
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I used to do a podcast with Margot Kingston, who was one of the journalists who really kind of foresaw that Pauline Hanson was probably going to be a long-term proposition. And one of her big things, which she's copped a lot of flack for, is saying that a lot of One Nation voters are talking to those issues, like those issues of actual income inequality or losing industrial jobs and things like that. Obviously, there's a lot of layers of other stuff on top. But we're in the midst of an election campaign in Victoria at the moment, which has been about migration, both explicitly and implicitly. Matthew Guy's campaign in particular has been focusing on the threat of African gangs, and I hope that's the last time we really have to say that term. Alongside general law and order issues, talk of rapid population growth, which again goes to the announcement earlier today. And we're in the fastest growing state in Australia, the census data tells us. I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic. Do you think there's a way to address the concerns of that broader electorate that's concerned about, losing industrial jobs, or it's probably smaller here than it is, say, somewhere like far north Queensland, where there are bigger issues. How do you appeal to those people and win them over without multiculturalism being the focus of the debate, or migration being the kind of proxy issue?
Well, I mean, what's going on really is politicians trying to cover for the lack of investment in infrastructure for decades. So, I mean, the Prime Minister's announcement here in Victoria, same story, total lack of investment in transport infrastructure, in housing infrastructure, in energy infrastructure, this focus on, building expensive toll roads rather than investing in public transport. All of those things contribute to people's concerns about quality of life. It's a real issue in New South Wales, for example. You find that this resonates most strongly in New South Wales, because in New South Wales, I mean, you've had a series of overtly corrupt governments at a state level. We know that.
Both sides.
On both sides.
Yeah.
On both sides. No. I mean, this is not a partisan issue. New South Wales have been governed for many years by governments of all persuasions that have engaged in corruption. They've been shown to they are not investing in the foundations of what it means to live in a successful modern 21st century city. So it is true, people, I travel a lot in this gig, and Sydney's a very congested city. There's a huge issue with affordable housing. People know that their energy bills are going up. Those aren't fictional problems, they're real problems. What they're trying to do is exploit divert from the real cause of the problem. The real cause of the problem is a lack of investment and planning. The job of state governments is to plan for this stuff. And even though Scott Morrison talks about, as he did today, reducing the migration intake by 30,000, which looks like it's an almost a certainty, let's not forget, that still means we're going to see an increase in the number of migrants coming to Australia. Whether it's 200,000 or 170,000 or 160,000, we're still going to see population growth. We're not planning for it.
We also don't have without those people, we don't really have the tax revenue to continue to plan for it either.
Well, this is the other thing to say. So, I mean, it's been, multiculturalism, immigration has been good for us culturally and socially. There's this language that I don't like, which is, people come here and they need to embrace Australian values. Well, actually, multiculturalism is much richer than that. It actually means that we come together as a society, and through our diversity, we reaffirm what these collective values are. It's not that Australia has a static set of ideas and values and you come here and you adopt them. The reason Australia has been such a prosperous country, a tolerant country, is because of our diversity, and it's that diversity that gives us, I think, what are our greatest strengths, those virtues of tolerance and all the things that we're very proud of. So I think that's the first thing to say about that. But the reality is that it's not just good for us socially and culturally, it's good for us economically. And, there's been lots of analysis on this to show that migration is of net economic benefit to Australia. And when you're talking about, as you said, a revenue base where we've got an ageing population, we're going to have people here. We need to do it sustainably, and we need to recognise we're working within environmental limits, but we need to do it in a way that recognises the contribution that's being made. So how do you attack it? Well, I think firstly, let's not be too defensive here. Most Australians are with us. Most Australians acknowledge that multiculturalism is a good thing. We need to acknowledge that and keep advancing the cause for multiculturalism as a good thing for all of the reasons we talked about, social, cultural and economic. And we have to keep prosecuting those arguments, and we have to keep calling out politicians who want to exploit this issue just on the basis of race.
I did want to ask you though, so I mean, that's good, and from a kind of broad picture, it's great.
Yep.
But particularly when we're talking about planning for infrastructure, I think one of the problems we probably have at a state level in Victoria is we're now going through that process of actually getting the infrastructure we probably needed about 20 years ago.
Correct, yep.
If you're someone in, say, it's always Western Sydney, let's not say Western Sydney, somewhere in Sydney, and you're saying, and you feel that you're feeling the pressure of like packed public transport or something like that, how do you appeal to that person that, there's a constant argument at the moment that we just need to have a pause on migration. How do you put that to people and bring them along, even if they are, broadly a pro-multiculturalism?
By naming the problem. The reason you're on a train and can't get in the door is because state governments aren't investing in it. By naming the problem. I mean, we could halt migration tomorrow. Your roads are going to still be clogged. Your energy costs are still going to be too high because governments have underinvested in the energy infrastructure, and where they have put money, they put it in the wrong areas. Where they're not, they're making the transition that we need to make towards renewable energy. They're not investing in schools and hospitals, and that's the fault of governments. It's not the fault of members of the community. So you've got to name that. And that's a challenge for all of us. It's not just a challenge for me, but it's a challenge for all of us within our community. The problem isn't your next door neighbour. The problem is governments that aren't investing in all of the foundations that we know make a modern, clean, livable city. That's the way you do it. Now, some people will never listen to that message. Some people will always, will always be much more likely to blame somebody with brown skin, somebody who doesn't speak their language. We have to accept that that's always going to be part of a small segment within the Australian community. But that's a very small segment within the Australian community. Most people are open to this sort of debate. Most people are sort of somewhere in the middle, and they're not sure of what's going on. They know their quality of life has suffered, and we need to name the cause, and we've got to have the solution. So talking about what does a modern 21st century transport system look like? People travel a lot. A lot of people have experienced what a modern 21st century transport system looks like. Well, we've got to start talking about what that looks like and the opportunities to invest in it. Investing in schools, hospitals, all of those things that are, that make Australia a livable place. The problem is governments, it's not people.
I wanted to ask about that and that kind of idea of getting people across the line who might be kind of a little bit, towards the idea of thinking, well, I'm not anti. I've got friends who are, of a multicultural background. I'm saying I'm a white person. I've got friends of a multicultural background. I enjoy all the benefits of a multicultural society, but I want to put a halt. I think a halt to migration isn't necessarily a bad thing, or something like that. In the US, there's very big discussion at the moment about the idea of the Overton window. The idea that there's this kind of broad idea of good ideas in the middle that we find acceptable, and that the way you shift that, left or right or up or down, depending on how you feel about politics, is to kind of throw those crazy ideas out there, like to throw the kind of more radical ideas out there, and that's how, say, we've shifted to kind of a centre-right kind of point of view, say, on economics or something like that. We see a lot of that on the political right, both in the US and in Australia. So things like bans on Muslim migration, which is an unfortunately recurring topic, or prioritising white South African farmers as refugees. without much evidence. Should we be seeing more of it from parties on the left in Australia, say the Greens?
So going more extreme in the opposite direction?
Yeah, seeing more of those bigger ideas.
Well, I'm not going to wear a burqa into Parliament. No, well, so let me answer the question this way. I don't think this idea that there's some mythical centre, I don't buy it.
Yep.
I think there are good ideas and bad ideas. And this idea that we should all be pitching to some centre ground, I don't think that's how politics works. I think politics is a battle of ideas, and some ideas win and some lose. And right now, when it comes to multiculturalism, you think you've won this thing, you think that multiculturalism was sort of settled decades ago and we're now fighting it again. Universal healthcare is another one. With, you think that Medicare is sort of embedded in Australian society, and then you see Tony Abbott come along and try and take it apart. So there's always a battle in politics, and the right answer isn't just some middle between two positions. The right answer is the right answer. And so when it comes to, yes, you're right, the right do try and talk to extremes. So you have Pauline Hanson wearing a burqa in Parliament. And it wasn't just, by the way, Pauline Hanson that talks about banning Muslim migration. People probably forget, but there was, a while ago, before Scott Morrison was Prime Minister, there was some reporting that Scott Morrison wanted to brought this idea to Cabinet. And he wasn't successful at Cabinet, but I'm concerned it's part of his thinking as well, and I wouldn't assume that it's been taken off the table completely. I think we have to win it in different ways. I think you do have to take a stand and call it out. When Pauline Hanson gave her first speech, I stood up in the Parliament with all of our colleagues. We walked out in the middle of that speech, and we were criticised. A lot of people said all you did was gave her too much attention, or you were disrespectful in the Parliament. That's not what the Parliament's for. Well, we don't think those ideas should have been granted an audience, and we weren't prepared to do it. So there are times when you do need to do those things, and I could talk to you about a number of other occasions where we've been very strong and criticised for our position. But you don't also want to engage in the same sort of tactics that your opponents engage in. I think what you do is you've got to keep advocating for good ideas. And when it comes to immigration, our immigration program is very successful. It's created jobs. What happens when we cut migration? Let's say we do what some of the Premier of New South Wales talks about, taking a breather, pausing on immigration. Well, if we've got 200,000 fewer people coming to Australia every year, we've got to recognise that that's going to have an impact on jobs in the construction industry. It's going to have an impact on jobs in aged care sector. It's going to have an impact on jobs in the transport sector. I mean, these things have serious and direct economic impacts.
I know that we've had someone, I couldn't tell you the person at the moment, for us at the conversation, particularly on the idea that if you cut migration for every person who becomes a permanent or at least long-term temporary resident in Australia, you effectively need like a factor of 6 people in tourism. So it's definitely even if we just think about this on economic terms, which sadly is often where we get back to.
Yes.
It's definitely a multiplier in that regard. I am not going to let you get away with not talking about the Pauline Hanson burqa story, because you were mentioning it earlier, and I think
so. Just a little story about when Pauline Hanson wore a burqa into Parliament. I was just saying this over lunch. So we had no idea, obviously, it was happening, and it was just before question time, and there was a woman walking down the corridor wearing a burqa and being escorted by 2 AFP officers who looked like they were being, a little intimidating. And one of my colleagues, Senator Peter Wish-Wilson, was walking towards question time, saw this, and walked to the woman and actually sort of stood in front of the AFP officers and said, "I hope you're okay, don't worry, we're with you. If you've got any issues, please let us know," and was very, very nice to her. And about 2 minutes later, walked into question time and saw this same woman sit down in Pauline Hanson's seat and realised he just had this conversation with Pauline Hanson. So there you go. It probably won't make it into her book, I don't imagine.
Yeah, interestingly, no mention of someone offering her help in the hallway. I wanted to ask you about the bill specifically on multiculturalism that you've introduced to Parliament, which would create an independent cultural commission, a multiculturalism commission. I apologise, that's actually the topic we're here to talk about. Can you talk me through what you hope that bill would achieve and what some of the statutory responsibilities of such a commission would be?
Yeah. So I'll perhaps tell you about the reason for it. One of the things we have to do is we have to get on the front foot, and rather than being on the back foot defending multiculturalism, we've got to get on the front foot and be talking about a positive, foundation for what multiculturalism is. Shifting it. Well, to use your language, that's right. Is rather than being, defending, we're being positive about multiculturalism. So countries like Canada, a few other jurisdictions have a National Multicultural Commission. It's enshrined in legislation. We've got a Multicultural Commission here in Victoria. We don't have one nationally. They've also got legislation that enshrines the principles, why we do it, the benefits of it, and how we make sure that we continue to encourage it and support multiculturalism. You do that in lots of different ways. So you establish an independent commission. That's a commission that can stand up and be an advocate. At the moment, really, we don't have many people standing up. We have interest groups, but to have an independent statutory body standing up, somebody who's charged with advancing multiculturalism and the structures that support it, we think is a really positive initiative. Collecting information at the moment, government departments do almost no reporting around diversity within the department. Playing a leadership role to ensure that there's more diversity within the private sector, on boards and so on, and holding, providing some much needed accountability in that area. As I said, data collection, information on accessibility government services, translators, interpreters, all of that stuff falls through the cracks. There are different bodies that have pieces of it, but actually having a national commitment to support the structures that mean that we continue to be a very successful multicultural community, that's the reason for doing it. To get on the front foot and say, we value it, it's part of who we are, let's keep building on it, and let's put the legislative structures around multiculturalism so that it's with us as a strong institution into the future.
So in some regard, it'd be similar to say some of the obligations and responsibilities the Human Rights Commission has, but with almost a more advocacy kind of role.
Correct.
Okay, cool, great.
Good idea, isn't it? Yes. We've got to get Labor support for it, by the way.
I was going to ask how
the
government...
The
electorate might be pro it and the Parliament might be still hard.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it would be broadly supported by the community. We're trying to get Labor over the line. I don't think they're going... I mean, the brutal politics at the moment is that the government's going to try and exploit this division. And what I worry about is obviously we saw on the back of that horrible crime in Bourke Street, these opportunists stand up and start smearing an entire community with the actions of a couple of people. I asked a question in Parliament, by the way, on that. I know it's a slight tangent, but, Scott Morrison stands up there and says, the Muslim community need to call this out. And so I stood up in Parliament and said, well, this is what the Muslim community is doing. I gave a long list of all of the really positive things that are being done at a community level through youth organisations, things that are being done through the work of imams right across the country, and actually documented it and said, this is what they're doing, what else do you want them to do? And no one can give you an answer, because it's not a question that demands an answer. It's a question designed to target a particular group in the community. Of course, we had a lot of positive response from the Muslim community on that, because no one else is saying this stuff. And I fear, and again, I don't want this to be a partisan exercise, but I fear that the Labor Party on this are afraid of looking like they're somehow soft on issues like terrorism and don't want to engage in this debate around population. I think they've committed to a population task force. Well, I'd rather see an infrastructure task force myself, because I think that's ultimately what we should be addressing.
I think it's one of those issues where, it's easy to report on a news item where something is literally on fire. It's much harder from a media point of view, not that I'm excusing a lot of the coverage, but it's much harder from a media point of view to report on the fact that the Muslim, various parts of the Islamic community are saying exactly the same things that they have said every time something like this happens, and when they're called upon to say it, the kind of person who doesn't want to hear what is being said will not hear it.
That's right.
And it's very hard to point people to an article when it's unlikely that article is going to be published.
Yes. And that's why I think on this, I don't blame the media for reporting what the Prime Minister says. It's their job. But the responsibility is with the Prime Minister and with Matthew Guy. I mean, this stuff around African gangs, honestly, it's a disgrace. It's just disgraceful that we would... I mean, Peter Dutton talks about not being able to go out, to a restaurant at night. I mean, this stuff is really, it's toxic. And it's got to be called out. It's cynical. We know why they're doing it. And it's really important that the response was terrific. It was mainly from the community, by the way, not from politicians. People need to take a stand against this and just know, just because Peter Dutton says it and just because the News Limited papers report it, doesn't mean that's how people think about it. Most people still, half the country is born overseas, has got a parent born overseas. And most people understand that this is not an issue of race or culture or religion. It's an issue of politicians who are, playing the politics of fear and division.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, the thing that keeps, the one part that is true of the stats is, the South Sudanese population is overrepresented. Well, we're talking about 1% of crime. And also, in a much smaller way, but Australian background people are much more overrepresented in our crime stats as well. But that's a separate issue.